Good afternoon. Welcome to Ron's Ramblings. This will be rambling number 15, which is part 6 in the life of Noah. And believe it or not, I think we're going to get to Noah's life in today's lesson. But before we get there, there's a thing or two I want us to look at. When time ran out last week, we were discussing some words that are used in Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, that have a great deal of bearing on what the world looked like in Noah's time. And I want to review those words to make sure that we clearly understand what's being said in those verses. The first word that we looked at is the word that I have highlighted on the screen in yellow. The firmament was in the midst of the waters. And we said, correctly so, that word does not mean in the middle of, like we often think, or in and among, like we often think. But rather, the Hebrew word tavek is the word that is used there and rendered as midst. And that means to sever or to bisect. And we talked about that to some extent last week. A more accurate rendering of verse 6, using the proper meaning for that word, would be something like, and God said, let there be a firmament to sever the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And verse 7 has another couple of words that we were looking at. The words that are rendered under and above. I had them highlighted in red and blue on the screen. And what verse 7 is telling us is that God divided the waters just like he divided the darkness back up in verse 4 when he said, let there be light to divide the darkness. And the dividing of the waters here is just like that. And so we discussed the Hebrew phrase that is rendered under in most of our English translations. That primary word that is used there is takath, and it really means bottom or beneath. And it takes that beneath meaning as it's used here because the water was beneath or under the firmament. And so it's rendered under in our English Bibles. We also looked at the Hebrew phrase that's rendered above in verse 7. And that is the Hebrew word eil, which in and of itself means over or upon. And it is rendered above using the over meaning of the word in our English Bibles. But that isn't the only word that is there. Those two words that are rendered under and above are not really words, they're phrases. In fact, they are two-word phrases. They have this word mini, or mene rather, as a part of that phrase. It would be mene takath, or mene eil. And when you find that word, mene, combined with some other word, what it does is it modifies the meaning of that word, the explicit meaning of that word, to include its own meaning, which is in or among or by reason of. So when we see those two words, takath, it becomes not just under, but in and under, or among and under. And when we see the word eil, it also becomes in and above, or among and above. It modifies the actual specific meaning of the word to include the in or the among, which is its meaning. And so I thought it might be a good idea for us to stop for a minute and consider the picture that we're forming in our minds as we discuss these verses. it may be that we're not all forming the same picture. And so I thought it might be a good idea for us to look into that for just a few minutes before we continue on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove me from the screen and present a series of slides for you, and then we'll discuss those slides as we go through with them. I think it'll help give us a better picture of what's going on here. So the first thing that you're going to see is a dark slide. There's nothing there. And that dark screen represents the Shamay that God created in the very beginning. It is that tremendously huge empty space into which God is going to put all of the things that he creates. Back in Genesis 1:1, where it states, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth," this is the word that is rendered heaven. And that's why it isn't capitalized, because it is just an empty space that has yet to have anything in it. After God created the Shamay, he then created the Eretz. This blue shape that you see on the screen represents what is rendered earth back in Genesis 1:1. It simply is a shape, a form, a mass. The definition of it is that it is a shapeless or an unformed or without form mass. It's void, so we don't know what shape it actually have. I drew a ball because we typically picture the world as a ball, as a globe, and so that's what I'm going to use to illustrate this as best I can. That word is also not capitalized, the word Eretz. And so when it's rendered in Genesis 1:1 that God created the heaven and the earth, Eretz is the word that is used to represent this mass. It's without form, it's void. It's simply a large mass of water that God created and set in the Shamay. And just as God created the light to separate the darkness, he will use the firmament to separate the waters of the Eretz. And so, on the second day, we see God creating a firmament that is going to divide this huge mass of water. It's going to sever one part of it from the other. He more or less bisected the water, which is the meaning of the word rendered mixed, as we saw before, by placing this firmament in the useless waters. Now, I've got it shown as a yellow circle on the screen, but that isn't really what happened. That's simply a starting point. God created the firmament. But what he did is he used that firmament to separate the waters that were above the firmament from the waters that are below the firmament. And so, as I have it illustrated here, it has expanded to the point to where there is still a ball of water in the center. And that, by the way, is going to become the physical earth. It isn't as big as that mass of water was that God created and placed in the Shamay. Because part of that water has been pushed out into the reaches of space, if you will, and lies above that firmament. And so that yellow area that you see there is considered to be the firmament. But remember, when we defined the word firmament last week, we defined it as not only being our atmosphere, but it also included all of what we call outer space. Remember, well, not remember because we haven't covered it, but in Genesis 1, verse 14, when God creates the lights and places them in the firmament, Uh, those lights that he placed in the firmament include the stars and the moon and the sun. The moon specifically, he said, is used for signs and seasons and for days and for years. So those things actually fit inside the firmament, but they aren't in our atmosphere. So actually, the firmament extends far out into the Shammai, and I don't know how far. So what I have done is I have just let it fill the screen. It just goes out into the Shammai. It includes most, if not all, of the Shammai, that empty space that he created. But in order for us to be able to distinguish between our own atmosphere and what lies beyond our atmosphere, I'll change the colors of that outer part of the firmament and call it outer space. But now remember, the purple color called outer space in this slide and the yellow inner ring called our atmosphere, both of those are the firmament. The firmament just extends on out. I just have no idea how far it is. But God separated the waters from the waters. And that's what's represented by this yellow part, this our atmosphere part, and the purple part in this slide. Typically, when we're told something is severed, the picture that we form in our minds, more often than not, is an absolute finite line of demarcation. And in this representation that I have on the screen, that finite line is the edge of the yellow that you see in the screen. Both the inner edge, which is the touching the earth, or what's going to become the earth, and the outer edge, which is touching the blue circle up there, that is the waters above the firmament. But remember, the Hebrew word maneh was modifying those that line of demarcation. It wasn't a definite, distinct line, because it's the meaning of the word maneh puts in and among as part of the definition. So I tried to illustrate what that might have looked like, and I'm not very good at doing things like that. But what I did was try to fuzzy up the edges. The point is, there's still two sides to each of those demarcation points. But the lines themselves are no longer absolute, finite lines like they were in the slide just before this. And so that blue ring that you see around the yellow ring, that's the waters above that part of the firmament that represents our atmosphere. And it also extends down to the atmosphere, the bottom of the atmosphere. And some of the blue, as you see, kind of mingles with the yellow in order to satisfy that maneh prefix. And the same is true down on the earth where the atmosphere is. The truth of the matter is, we're not told where or how wide the boundary area is. God didn't see fit to tell us that. We don't even know how far it stretches into space. But the point that we need to see here is that the lines are not absolute. They're not distinct. Today, we have water below our ground. We have springs that flow year-round. We have underground streams, rivers, and lakes. Back in Noah's time, Those underground lakes, rivers, and streams were called the fountains of the deep. I'm pretty sure this slide does not illustrate it properly, but I believe the boundaries between the firmament and the waters were broad and they were gradual, allowing the waters above the firmament to also be in the firmament, as the word mene alludes to. Just where that upper boundary was, I can't say. Perhaps it formed a canopy, as some of the scientists believe. Or maybe it was just a band of water in the troposphere or stratosphere, as I've depicted on this slide. But regardless of exactly where the water was, the view of the scientists that we spoke of in the last lesson, almost to a person, agree that a significant amount of water is above the firmament. And when they say that, they are referring to the part of the firmament that forms our atmosphere. And they say that those scientists are also creationists, and so they believe in creation. And they're saying that God positioned that band of water, or that canopy of water, whatever you want to call it, in such a way that it filtered the light, specifically the infrared and the ultraviolet rays that reached the earth. They say without question that the harmful infrared and ultraviolet rays drastically affect a person's lifespan. Without those rays, we would live much longer and healthier lives than we live today. And the water would also do something else. It would insulate the earth. It would not allow the heat to be dissipated into the cold of outer space during the nighttime hours when the sun isn't shining. And those two things work together, and they would form sort of a greenhouse effect on the earth, in which the temperatures would pretty much remain moderate all over the earth. A temperate temperature, if you will. And so, that greenhouse climate would provide lush plant life. Most likely it would provide larger animals also. While we're speaking about these things, let me introduce some facts to you. The first one is, scientists and geologists have found fossils of tropical plants in the Arctic regions of the earth that today would not allow them to live because of the colder climate. These scientists have found remains of huge animals, one of which was a woolly mammoth that you see pictured on the screen here. They have been found in the Arctic region in almost perfect condition, frozen in the ice, perfectly preserved by that freezing. And it happened, they say, as if it were a quick froze thing. That is to say, it happened so quickly and they froze to death so quickly that the food in their stomachs had not even had time to be digested. And so some of these animals have been found, and when they are examined after thawing them out, still have undigested food in their stomachs, and even in some cases foliage in their mouths, leaves that they were eating, whatever happened. And we have found, or they, the scientists, have found fossils of marine life in desert areas where little of no water exists, and high up on mountaintops where fish could not possibly have been. What you see on the screen, the two top fossils, one of those was found high in the Andes Mountains, the one on the left. The one on the upper right was found in the middle of Arizona. not where there's any lakes nearby, but in an arid land. And you'll see on the lower right in this slide that there is some scientists looking at giant oysters, if you will, that exist in the desert area, in the wilderness area, where there is no reason for them to be able to be there. So, I believe by the verses that we see and the findings that science has given to us, that the book of beginnings, the book of Genesis, are worded in such a way that they show us a different type of world existed then as exists now, because the scientists cannot explain how those events happened and how those fossils happened. And they aren't the only ones. There's many others. How that could be, it is completely baffling to them, and they just can't understand it. Well, let's get to Noah's life. This chart shows the timeline of the first 20 patriarchs, Adam through Abraham. I'm covering up some of the ones, but the ones that we're interested in are Noah and the ones above it. Noah is the 10th name on that list. His father was Lamech. His grandfather was Methuselah, the oldest person ever to live on the earth. His great-grandfather was Enoch, whom we talked about just before we began this discussion on Noah. Remember, Enoch was taken directly into heaven by God and never experienced a physical death, because it is said of him, Enoch walked with God. The chart shows that Enoch was taken 987 years after creation. Noah was born 1,056 years after creation. So even in a time where people lived extremely long lives, Noah never met his great-grandfather, Enoch. Enoch was dead before Noah was born. Genesis 7 is going to tell us that the flood began on the 17th day of the second month in the 600th year of Noah's life. The 600th year of Noah's life would have been the year 1656 after creation. If you look on that chart, for the year that Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, died, you will notice that he died in 1656. Either Methuselah died in the first 47 days of the year 1656 AC, that's after creation now. We're not talking about BC here. That would be right at the time when the flood began. We said the flood began in the 17th day of the second month. So either Methuselah died just prior to the flood, or else he died in the flood. I prefer to think that he was a righteous man and died before the flood, but I don't know that. And notice also that Noah's father, Lamech, died in 1651. That's after creation years. That was about 5 years before the flood. I want to think that he was a righteous man too. But we can't say that about all of the other family members that may have been alive when Noah got in the ark. We're told that Lamech lived 777 years. And during that 777 years, he was the father of children. Noah, and all of Noah's brothers and sisters. We don't read anything about Noah's brothers and sisters. Only 8 people were on the ark. So any of Noah's family that may have been alive, that would include brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever. If they were alive when Noah got in the ark, then they were not righteous people. And other than what we see here so far in regard to Noah, his birth occurred in 1056 before or after creation. And it said that when he was born, his father Lamech said, "He will comfort us concerning our work and toil because of the grounds which the Lord has cursed." There was a lot of trouble on the earth at that time. We see in Genesis chapter 6 that God was already displeased with man because the men were taking wives of all of the women that they wanted, and they chose whomever they chose, and as many as they chose, they were taking to be their wives. God didn't expect it to be that way. He didn't plan for it to be that way. Also, God said, "My spirit should not always strive with man." And he told us that man's days is going to be reduced to 120 years. It's going to take a little time for that to happen. But those who are born after the flood, you're going to see that their lives were shortened tremendously from the 800 and 900 years that was being lived before them. And then there's the phrase in verse 4 that says there were giants in the earth in those days. And those giants intermarried with the daughters of men, verse 5 says, and produced mighty men of old, men of renown. I'm not sure I know what that means, other than the fact that they were probably huge people, strong people, mighty in the sense of what they could accomplish. People were known for their size and for their strength. I don't know it, but I don't think that God is talking about their reputation. I think he's talking about the physicalness of it. And so in verse 5, we find that God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, it says, and that every imagination of man's heart was evil continually. And that's what the conditions were at the time that Noah was born and during the first 600 years of his life. Verse 6 says that it repented God that he had made man on the earth. He was grieved in his heart. And so he made up his mind, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping things, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." God was very, very displeased. Humanity as a whole had done a complete about-face from following him. And it started right there in the garden with Adam and Eve when they ate that fruit that they shouldn't have eaten. Yes, there have been good men like Enoch who walked with God. And it says in verse 17 that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah, it is also said of him that he walked with God. We'll talk more about his life next time. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a good day.